Sign the papers, Mara. It's what's best for you.
You stopped deciding what's best for me the day I buried my husband.
Then I'll make sure you lose everything.
Mara Doyle buried her husband on a Tuesday, and by Friday, a man who was not her husband was already deciding what would happen to the rest of her life. She had $4 folded into the palm of her glove, a 5-year-old daughter asleep in the next room, and exactly 1 day left to decide whether she would let him. This is the story of a widow with almost nothing left, a rancher who had already buried more than his share of people he loved, and the man who was determined to take everything from both of them before either one realized what was happening. It begins on the Kansas prairie, in the spring of 1884, and it ends in a place neither Mara nor the man she was about to marry could have imagined for themselves. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 6 months earlier, Mara had been Mrs. Thomas Doyle, wife of the owner of Doyle's Feed and Grain in Millbrook, Kansas, a small crossroads town where everyone knew everyone else's business before it happened to them. Thomas had been a steady, unremarkable man who balanced his ledgers every Sunday night and never once raised his voice in 11 years of marriage. Then, in the space of 8 days, a fever took him. Mara went from a wife with a husband's income to a widow with a 5-year-old daughter, a half share in a feed store, and no clear idea how any of it actually worked. That was where Elias Cobb came in. Thomas's business partner had been at the funeral, at the house the week after, and at the house nearly every week since, always with some small kindness in hand, a bolt of fabric for her daughter, a jar of preserves, an offer to look over the accounts so Mara wouldn't have to trouble herself. He was careful never to raise his voice either. He simply arrived with his decisions already made, laid them out like they were gifts, and seemed genuinely confused whenever Mara hesitated to accept them. By March, Elias had started calling the store our arrangement instead of Mara's inheritance. By April, he had begun suggesting, gently and often, that a widow alone in business was an invitation to trouble, and that the sensible thing would be for the two of them to formalize what he called their partnership into something more permanent. He never used the word marriage outright. He didn't have to. Everyone in Millbrook understood exactly what he meant, and most of them, including Mara's own mother, thought she should be grateful for the offer. Mara was not grateful. She could not have said precisely why the idea of marrying Elias Cobb made her stomach turn the way it did, only that every time he sat across from her with the account books open, patiently explaining numbers she understood perfectly well on her own, she felt smaller than she had the day before. He was not cruel. He was not even unkind. He simply could not imagine a version of her life that did not run through him, and after 6 months of watching him rearrange her future in small, reasonable-sounding pieces, Mara had started to believe he might be right, that maybe there was no version of her life that didn't. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in April, she'd gone to the mercantile for flour and found herself standing over the newspaper rack instead, reading a notice tucked between an announcement for a barn raising and a notice about a missing mule. 6 lines. No flattery. No promises. A rancher named Wes Calder, 200 miles west past Dodge City, needed a wife willing to help him raise his late sister's twin boys and run a household in a place where, as the notice put it, no one already knew her business. Mara read those 6 lines 4 times before she understood why her hands had gone still. It was the first thing in 6 months that had asked her a real question instead of handing her an answer. She wrote back that same night, before she could talk herself out of it, and told herself it was only a letter, that nothing had to come of it. A reply came 3 weeks later with a train ticket folded inside and 6 words that changed the shape of everything. The wedding would be the Saturday after she arrived. Mara read that letter standing at the mail counter with her knees not entirely steady beneath her, folded it into her glove next to the $4 she had left after Elias's most recent visit, and walked home already knowing what she was going to do, even before she let herself say it out loud. When Mara told Elias she was leaving, he did not shout. He sat very still for a long moment, then said, in the same gentle voice he always used, that he understood grief made people do foolish things, and that the store, and the debts still owed on it, would still be there whenever she came to her senses. He said the word debts almost carelessly, the way a man mentions weather, and Mara noticed it even through the fog of her own resolve, though she wouldn't understand why it had stayed with her until much later. He offered to drive her to the depot himself. She declined and told him she would manage. She packed light, a trunk with clothes for herself and her daughter, a few of Thomas's things she couldn't bring herself to sell, and a small wooden box of his old business papers she'd never had the heart to sort through, tucked in almost as an afterthought, because throwing it away had felt like throwing him away too. Her daughter, 5 years old and entirely unbothered by the size of the decision being made on her behalf, wanted to know if the rancher had horses, and whether the twin boys would want to play, and whether Kansas grass felt different from Millbrook grass. Mara answered every question as though it were the only thing on her mind, because it was easier than answering the ones she was asking herself. They boarded the westbound train on a gray Thursday morning, and Mara did not look back at the platform, though she could feel Elias Cobb standing on it anyway, watching her go. The train ride took the better part of 2 days, and for the first several hours, Mara spent most of it staring out the window at land that kept getting flatter and emptier, wondering what kind of man wrote a courtship letter the way most men wrote a contract for cattle. She had his 3 letters memorized by then. They were plain, almost blunt, and entirely without the kind of flourishes Elias used so easily. Wes Calder wrote about the ranch, about the 2 boys he was raising, about the size of the house and the fact that it needed a woman's hand in ways he didn't feel equipped to describe. He never once told her she was pretty, because he had never seen her, and he never once promised her happiness, because, as he put it in his second letter, he didn't think a stranger had any business promising a thing like that. Somewhere past the Kansas border, an older woman traveling alone took the seat across from her and, within the hour, had gotten the whole story out of Mara simply by being kind enough to ask the right questions in the right order. Her name was Hannah Whitfield, and she was returning from her sister's funeral to a homestead not far from Larkspur, close enough to Wes Calder's ranch that she laughed out loud when Mara said his name. "Wes Calder wrote you a letter that plain and you still got on the train?" Hannah asked, and when Mara admitted she had, Hannah nodded slowly, like she'd just had a suspicion confirmed. "Well," she said, "that tells me something about you, and it tells me something about him too, if you want my opinion, which you didn't ask for, but you're getting anyway." Hannah talked for the better part of an afternoon, about the country, about the winters, about a rancher's life and what it asked of a woman who'd only ever known a town. Somewhere in the middle of all that talking, Mara realized she had stopped bracing for the moment Hannah would tell her she'd made a terrible mistake. It never came. By the time the train pulled into the small depot outside Larkspur, Mara had a friend 2 hours old and a great deal less fear than she'd boarded with. What fear remained gathered itself all at once the moment the train slowed and she saw a tall man standing alone on the platform, hat in his hands instead of on his head, looking like he'd rather be facing down a stampede than the next 5 minutes. He did not smile when he saw her. He simply looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he's been trying not to hope for, and said, "Mrs. Doyle," like he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to. Mara said, "Mr. Calder," and her daughter, 5 years old and entirely without her mother's caution, asked immediately if he had a horse she could ride. Something in Wes Calder's careful, guarded face cracked just slightly at the corners, the first sign Mara had that the man in the letters and the man on the platform might actually be the same person after all. They were married 2 days later, on the Saturday the letter had promised, in front of a circuit preacher named Reverend Wallace and exactly 4 witnesses, Hannah Whitfield, who had insisted on staying the extra day. A ranch hand named Otis who worked for Wes and cried without any apparent embarrassment through the entire 5-minute ceremony, and the 2 boys Mara had come 200 miles to help raise, 7-year-old twins named Jack and Robert, who stood at their uncle's side in shirts a size too small and watched the whole proceeding with matching expressions of deep suspicion. The boys had lost their mother, Wes's younger sister Laura, to a fever the previous winter, not long after their father had been thrown from a horse and killed on a cattle drive. In the space of 4 months, they had gone from a family of 4 to a household of 1 exhausted uncle who loved them fiercely and had no real idea what he was doing. Wes had told Mara as much in his second letter, in the same plain, unadorned way he told her everything, and she had appreciated the honesty even as it worried her. Grieving children did not, in her experience, take kindly to strangers arriving to fill gaps that weren't theirs to fill, and she was right to worry. Jack, the older twin by 11 minutes and the more openly resentful of the two, did not speak to her for the better part of a week, answering every question with a shrug and finding urgent reasons to be anywhere she wasn't. Robert was quieter about it, polite in the careful, watchful way children are polite when they've learned that adults leave, one way or another, and he'd rather not get attached to one more person he might have to lose. Her own daughter, meanwhile, adjusted to ranch life as though she'd been born for it, trailing after the twins with the fearless persistence of a 5-year-old who had decided, entirely on her own authority, that they were going to be friends whether they liked it or not. The house itself was small and plain, built for practicality rather than comfort, and Mara spent her first 2 weeks learning its rhythms the way a sailor learns a new ship, carefully, and mostly by making mistakes. She burned the first 3 loaves of bread she baked in the unfamiliar oven. She learned the hard way which chair by the stove belonged, by unspoken household law, to Wes alone. She discovered that Robert liked his eggs a particular way and would eat almost nothing if they weren't prepared exactly so, and that Jack, for all his coldness toward her, would not tolerate anyone speaking sharply to his brother, not even Wes. Wes himself remained, for those first weeks, almost painfully formal with her, as though he were afraid that any warmth he showed might be mistaken for something he had no right to expect. He worked from before sunrise until well past dark, came in for meals with dirt still on his hands and gratitude in his eyes that he rarely put into words, and retreated each night to the small room he'd built onto the back of the house so that Mara and her daughter could have the larger bedroom to themselves. He had made that arrangement clear in his letters, and he honored it without a single moment of pressure or complaint, and it was that, more than anything else, that began to soften something in Mara that had been braced tight since the day Thomas died. The turn, when it came, was a small one. 3 weeks in, Mara found Wes sitting alone on the porch steps well after the boys were asleep, turning a woman's hair comb over and over in his hands. When she asked, gently, whose it was, he told her it had been his sister's, the only thing of Laura's the boys hadn't wanted kept in the house because it made Robert cry to see it. He'd been carrying it in his coat pocket for 4 months, he admitted, not entirely sure why. Mara sat down beside him on the step without being invited and said that she still had one of Thomas's ledgers she couldn't bring herself to open either, and that maybe grief simply worked that way, holding on to small useless things because they were easier to hold than the actual loss. They sat there a long while, not saying much else, and it was the first time Wes Calder looked at her like she was a person he might actually come to know, rather than an arrangement he'd made out of necessity. Mara went to bed that night thinking, for the first time since she'd read his letters, that she might have done more than survive a difficult decision. She might have made a good one. The weeks that followed brought small, steady changes that Mara only noticed in hindsight, the way a person notices a season has turned only once the trees are already bare. Jack started answering her questions with more than a shrug. Robert let her braid a leather cord onto his fishing pole the way she'd once done for Thomas, and didn't flinch when she called him honey by accident one morning at breakfast. Her own daughter had appointed herself the twins' official younger sister, whether they'd voted on the matter or not, and by the end of May, the 3 children were inseparable in the way of siblings who'd simply decided, without ceremony, that they belonged to each other. Wes remained careful with her, but the careful had changed shape. He started saving her the good cuts of meat without being asked. He fixed the sticking door on her side of the house without being asked. He began, in small and clumsy ways, to talk about the ranch, about Laura, about a childhood in Missouri neither of them had ever mentioned to the other before. Mara found herself doing the same, telling him things about Thomas and Millbrook and even Elias Cobb that she hadn't planned to say out loud to anyone. Wes listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished the part about Elias calling the feed store the arrangement, his jaw tightened in a way she hadn't seen before, though he didn't say anything else about it that night. It was around this same stretch of weeks that Wes began taking Mara's daughter out to the corral most evenings after supper, setting her up on the back of an old, patient mare named Clover and walking beside them at a pace slow enough that nothing could possibly go wrong. He never announced these lessons or asked anyone's permission to give them. He simply started doing it, the same unhurried way he did most things, and within 2 weeks the girl could manage a walk and a trot on her own, sitting the saddle with a fierce, delighted concentration that reminded Mara, uncomfortably at first and then not uncomfortably at all, of the way Thomas used to look explaining sums to her in the evenings. Watching Wes lift her daughter down from the saddle each night, patient with every wrong instruction and quick with every honest compliment, Mara understood that whatever else this marriage was or wasn't, the man she'd married had decided, without being asked, to love a child who wasn't his simply because she needed loving. That alone, Mara thought more than once, would have been enough to make the whole arrangement worth it, even if nothing else about it had ever changed. In early June, before any of what came later, the whole of Larkspur turned out for the town's annual Founders' Day picnic, and Mara found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, introduced to an entire community as simply Wes Calder's wife, rather than as the widow everyone was quietly managing. The women of Larkspur were plainer and more direct than the women of Millbrook had ever been, less interested in whispered opinions about her circumstances and considerably more interested in whether she preferred her pie crust with lard or butter. Mara found the bluntness came as something of a relief after 6 months of careful, managed kindness back home. Wes, who by his own admission was not a man built for crowds, spent most of the afternoon at her elbow anyway, introducing her to neighbors with a quiet pride in his voice that Mara noticed even though he clearly hadn't meant to let it show. Late in the day, when one of the ranch hands struck up a fiddle and a handful of couples began an unhurried dance in the trampled grass near the creek, Wes surprised her, and possibly himself, by asking if she'd care to join him. He admitted, as he led her out, that he hadn't danced with anyone since his sister's wedding years before and couldn't make any promises about his footwork. He was, in fact, a perfectly competent dancer, careful and unhurried in the same way he did most things. Mara spent 3 full songs in his arms without either of them saying very much at all, because for the first time since she'd stepped off the train, there was nothing that needed explaining or managing or surviving. There was only a fiddle, and warm June light, and a man who had married her out of necessity 6 weeks earlier now holding her like he'd meant to do it all along. By the second week of June, the wheat was tall enough to worry about, and everyone on the Calder place had one eye on the sky the way ranch families did that time of year, watching for the particular green-gray color that meant trouble was on its way. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, fast enough that Wes barely had time to get the cattle moved toward the low pasture before the wind turned hard and cold and the sky went the color of a bruise. Mara got the boys and her daughter into the house and away from the windows, the way Hannah Whitfield had once told her to during a storm years before Mara had ever set foot in Kansas. For nearly 20 minutes the 4 of them sat pressed together under the kitchen table while the wind tore at the roof and something large and unseen crashed against the side of the barn. It was Jack, counting heads in the dark the way children do when they're frightened and trying not to show it, who first realized Robert wasn't with them. He'd slipped out during the worst of the confusion, chasing after a barn cat he'd only had for 2 weeks and had already decided he couldn't live without. By the time Mara understood what had happened, the wind outside had reached a pitch that made the idea of going out into it feel like stepping off the edge of something. She went anyway. She would think, later, that she hadn't actually decided to go, that her body had simply moved before the rest of her caught up, the same way it had moved the day she walked out of Elias Cobb's house for the last time. She found Robert in the barn, soaked through and shaking, the cat clutched against his chest and a gash above his eyebrow where a swinging door had caught him in the dark. She got them both back to the house in a stretch of time that felt, afterward, like it must have taken an hour and had probably taken less than 3 minutes. By the time Wes came in from the pasture 40 minutes later, half the roof of the smaller barn was gone, 2 of the cattle were missing, and Robert was sitting wrapped in a blanket by the stove with 4 stitches Mara had put in herself, the cat still refusing to leave his lap. Wes did not say much when he saw them. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, put one hand on Robert's head and the other, without seeming to think about it at all, on the side of Mara's face, and stood there for a long moment just breathing, Like a man confirming for himself that something he'd been afraid to lose was still actually there. Later, after the children were finally asleep and the worst of the storm had rolled east, Wes found Mara on the porch and stood beside her without speaking for a while. He told her, quietly, that he did not know what he would have done if something had happened to Robert while he was out chasing cattle instead of home with his family. He said the word family plainly, without hesitation, as though he'd been building up to being able to say it and the storm had simply knocked the last of his caution loose. Mara didn't say anything back. She reached over and took his hand instead, and he let her, and they stood there together until well past midnight, watching the last of the clouds clear off toward the east. By July, no one on the ranch called it an arrangement anymore, not even in their own heads. Wes had moved his things back into the main bedroom without either of them making a formal announcement about it, and the shift happened so naturally that Mara couldn't have said which night, exactly, it had occurred. The boys called her Ma now, hesitantly at first and then without thinking about it at all, and her own daughter had started calling Wes Pa sometime in early June and never looked back. Mara wrote to Hannah Whitfield that summer that she had come to Kansas expecting, at best, a peaceful and practical life, and had instead found something she hadn't let herself want since Thomas died, something she still didn't entirely trust because it had come so easily after everything that hadn't. She should have trusted her instincts more than she did. Peace, in Mara's experience, rarely lasted as long as it deserved to, and 400 miles east, in a small office above Doyle's Feed and Grain, Elias Cobb had spent the summer discovering exactly how much trouble a missing widow's signature could actually cause him. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late July, forwarded twice before it finally reached the Calder Ranch, and Mara knew before she opened it that something in her old life had followed her, because Elias Cobb had never once, in 6 months of visiting her parlor, written her a letter when he could simply show up and rearrange her afternoon instead. This letter was polite, even warm in places, full of concern for her welfare and hope that married life suited her. Buried in the third paragraph, almost as an afterthought, was the actual reason he'd written. A lawyer in Millbrook had opened a review of Thomas's estate following a routine audit of the store's accounts, and certain discrepancies had come to light that would require Mara's signature, and possibly her testimony, to resolve. Mara read the letter 4 times at the kitchen table before she said a word to Wes, and when she finally handed it to him, she watched his face change the same way it had the night he'd told her about Elias calling the store at the arrangement. He asked her, carefully, what kind of discrepancies a store like Thomas's could possibly produce, and Mara admitted she didn't know, because she had never once looked closely at the books herself. She had trusted Elias to handle all of it, the way a grieving, overwhelmed widow trusts the one person who keeps offering to make things easier. It was Wes who suggested, gently, that the small wooden box of Thomas's papers sitting untouched in the bottom of her trunk since April might finally be worth opening. They went through it together that night, by lamplight, long after the children were asleep. Most of it was exactly what Mara had expected: receipts, correspondence, the dull paper trail of a small-town business. Tucked in the back, in Thomas's own careful handwriting, was a private ledger that didn't match the one Elias had always shown her, a second set of numbers that tracked a series of loans against the store's credit that Mara had never known existed, loans that had grown steadily larger in the 2 years before Thomas died. According to the dates in that ledger, the borrowing had continued for months after Thomas's funeral. Someone had kept borrowing against Doyle's Feed and Grain using Thomas's name, long after Thomas was no longer alive to have signed anything. Wes read the last page twice, then looked up at her and asked the question Mara had already started asking herself. If the loans had continued after Thomas's death, and Thomas's own signature couldn't have authorized them, whose signature had Elias been using instead? Mara didn't have to answer out loud. They both understood, sitting there at the kitchen table with a dead man's ledger between them, that Elias Cobb's sudden concern for her welfare, 4 months and 200 miles too late, had very little to do with missing her, and everything to do with a debt he needed someone else's name attached to before anyone came looking closely enough to notice it was his. Wes wanted to write to a lawyer immediately. Mara wanted more than that. She had spent 6 months in Millbrook learning to shrink herself smaller every time Elias Cobb walked into a room, and she was not interested in fighting him from 200 miles away with a letter he could simply ignore, the way he had ignored every hesitation she'd ever shown him in person. She wanted to go back to Millbrook herself, with the ledger, and she wanted Elias Cobb to explain those numbers to her face, in front of people who would believe her over him. They didn't have to travel far to make that happen. 3 weeks after the letter arrived, before Mara had finished arranging the trip east, Elias Cobb arrived at the Calder Ranch himself, unannounced, in a hired buggy that looked entirely out of place against the flat Kansas horizon. He had come, he explained to Wes at the door, out of concern, and out of a sense of obligation to see that Mara's affairs back home were properly settled, and he would very much appreciate a few minutes of her time to discuss some documents that only needed her signature to resolve the whole unfortunate matter. Mara came to the door herself before Wes could answer for her. Elias smiled at her the way he always had, warm and patient and entirely certain of his own reasonableness, and for one unsteady moment, standing in the doorway of the house that had become her real home, Mara felt some small, familiar part of herself start to shrink again out of old habit. Then she looked past him at the buggy, at the leather folder of papers tucked under his arm, at the careful way he was avoiding looking directly at Wes standing solid and silent at her shoulder, and the old habit simply didn't take hold the way it used to. "You can say whatever you came to say out here, in front of my husband," Mara told him, "or you can say it in town, in front of the sheriff. Those are the only 2 choices I'm offering you, Elias." It was the first time in 6 months of knowing him that she had ever interrupted whatever he was about to say next, and something in his expression flickered, just briefly, before the pleasant mask came back down over it. He tried, for a while, to keep the conversation on his own familiar ground. Gentle concern. Reasonable explanations. The same patient tone he'd used for 6 months to make his decisions sound like hers. He told her the loans were a simple accounting matter, a misunderstanding created by Thomas's own sloppy record-keeping before he died, and that signing the documents he'd brought would settle everything quietly and spare her the unpleasantness of a formal estate review. He held the leather folder out to her like it was a kindness rather than a demand, and for 6 months in Millbrook, that gesture had always been enough. It wasn't enough now. Mara had Thomas's private ledger in her own hands, the pages marked with dates she and Wes had gone through line by line the night the letter arrived, and she read 3 of those dates aloud to Elias standing on her own porch, watching his careful expression falter for the first time since she'd met him. He tried, briefly, to explain the discrepancies away as clerical error, then as a misunderstanding between business partners. When Wes asked flatly which explanation he intended to offer the bank examiner conducting the audit, Elias Cobb stopped explaining anything at all. They rode into Larkspur together that same afternoon, at Mara's insistence and over Elias's increasingly weak objections, and sat across a desk from a lawyer named Mr. Pruitt while Mara laid Thomas's ledger open between them and told him, plainly, what she believed had happened. Mr. Pruitt was not a Millbrook man with 6 months of habit built up around trusting Elias Cobb's easy smile. He was a stranger who read numbers for a living, and it took him less than 20 minutes with Thomas's ledger to confirm what Mara and Wes had already suspected, that someone had continued borrowing against Doyle's feed and grain for the better part of a year using a dead man's name, and that the signature on the most recent loan documents, while a passable imitation, was not Thomas Doyle's handwriting at all. Elias Cobb did not confess, exactly. He simply stopped talking, the color draining slowly out of his face as Mr. Pruitt explained, in the flat, unhurried language of a man who had seen this particular situation before, what forging a dead man's signature on a loan document tended to cost a person in the state of Kansas. He asked, once, in a voice that had finally lost all its patient warmth, what it was Mara actually wanted, and Mara told him. She wanted the debt against the store settled using his own assets, not Thomas's estate. She wanted a signed statement, witnessed by Mr. Pruitt, admitting exactly what he'd done, to be held in reserve should he ever come near her or her family again. And she wanted him gone from Millbrook by the time she next had reason to write to anyone there. He agreed to all 3 conditions with considerably less grace than he had once offered her preserves and fabric for her daughter, and Mara found, watching him sign the statement Mr. Pruitt drew up, that she felt almost nothing at all, neither triumph nor relief nor even much anger, only the quiet, settled sense of a door closing on something that no longer had any power to follow her. Wes stood behind her the entire time, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, saying almost nothing, because he understood, correctly, that this was not a moment that needed him to say anything at all. Word of what Elias Cobb had done did not stay contained to Mr. Pruitt's office for long. Larkspur was a small town, and Millbrook was smaller still, and by the time autumn came around, the story had traveled the full 200 miles back east in the particular way that stories about a respected man's disgrace always seem to travel faster than any train. Elias sold his half of the feed store within the month, at considerably less than it was worth, and left Millbrook before the snow came, and nobody in town, as far as Mara ever heard, thought to ask where he'd gone. She found she didn't much care to know either. There had been a time, not so long before, when the idea of Elias Cobb's opinion of her had mattered enough to shape entire afternoons of her life, and it surprised her, in a quiet way, how completely that had stopped being true. They rode back to the ranch in the last of the daylight, and Mara didn't speak again about Elias Cobb, or the store, or Millbrook, not because the day hadn't mattered, but because it already felt, somehow, like it belonged to a life she'd stopped living months earlier without quite noticing the exact moment it happened. The children were waiting on the porch when they arrived, Robert's cat curled in his lap, Jack pretending he hadn't been watching the road for the last hour, her own daughter running out to meet the wagon before it had even fully stopped. Wes lifted her down, then reached for Mara's hand to help her from the wagon, and held onto it a moment longer than the step down actually required. That night, once the children were finally asleep, Wes found Mara on the porch again, the same spot where he'd once shown her his sister's hair comb, and told her, without much preamble, that he had married her in April because it was the practical thing to do, the sensible arrangement two lonely, overworked people had made out of necessity rather than feeling. He said he wasn't sorry for it, but that it wasn't true anymore, hadn't been true for months, and that he'd wanted to tell her properly instead of just letting her guess it from the way he'd started acting. Mara didn't answer him right away. She sat with what he'd said for a long moment, looking out at the dark shape of the barn Wes had already started rebuilding after the storm, at the lit windows of a house that held 3 children who called them both by names neither had been born with. She thought about how strange it was that the arrangement she'd agreed to out of nothing but desperation and spite had somehow become the truest thing in her life. When she finally spoke, she told him that she had married him because a rancher's plain, unromantic letter had felt more honest than anything a man who claimed to care for her had ever managed to say, and that she'd been waiting, without quite admitting it to herself, for him to feel something he didn't have to say plainly either, because by then she'd have already known. Wes turned toward her on the step and, in the careful, deliberate way he did most things that mattered to him, told her he loved her. He said it plainly, the same way he'd written his letters, without decoration, and Mara found that she believed it more completely than she had ever believed anything Elias Cobb had spent 6 months trying to convince her of with flowers and fabric and gentle, constant persuasion. She told him she loved him too, and meant it, and they sat together on the porch steps until the lamp in the front room burned itself out. The following spring brought a wedding of an entirely different kind, though almost no one in Larkspur outside the family understood it as one. Reverend Wallace came out to the ranch on a Sunday in April, exactly a year after the first quiet ceremony, and married Wes and Mara Calder a second time, in front of the whole family this time. Jack and Robert stood up with their uncle the way they had before, except now they stood there as sons rather than reluctant witnesses. Her own daughter, 6 years old and entirely certain of her own importance in the proceedings, insisted on carrying flowers even though no one had actually asked her to. Hannah Whitfield came for the occasion, and cried through the ceremony exactly as thoroughly as Otis had the first time, and told anyone who would listen that she had known, the very afternoon she met Mara on that westbound train, that Wes Calder's plain letter had found exactly the right woman to answer it. Mr. Pruitt sent a card from Larkspur with his congratulations, along with a brief note confirming that Elias Cobb had, as agreed, left Millbrook for good the previous autumn, and that the store, now managed by a cousin of Thomas's with considerably more honesty and considerably less charm, was doing well enough that Mara's share of it would provide comfortably for her daughter's future whenever she was old enough to want it. Mara's mother did not attend either wedding. She wrote instead a stiff and dutiful letter after the first ceremony expressing hope that Mara knew what she was doing, and a considerably warmer one after the second, once word had reached Millbrook of exactly what Elias Cobb had done and exactly how close he had come to costing Mara everything. It took her mother the better part of 2 years to admit, in a letter Mara kept alongside Thomas's ledger in a drawer she no longer needed to avoid, that she had been wrong to push so hard toward the safe, familiar choice, and that watching her own daughter build an entirely different kind of life out of 6 honest lines in a newspaper had taught her something about courage she was too old, she said, to have expected to still be learning. The clearest sign of how far they'd all come arrived on an ordinary Tuesday the following spring, when Jack, 12 years old by then and taller than Mara by a full head, came running in from the barn to tell her, breathless and entirely unself-conscious, that one of the Maras had foaled early and he needed his ma to come see. He said it in front of 2 ranch hands and a traveling peddler who happened to be at the house that morning, without a flicker of hesitation. Mara had to turn away for a moment to wipe her eyes before she followed him out to the barn, because 4 years earlier that same boy had gone an entire week without speaking a single word to her. Robert, for his part, still kept his mother's hair comb, though it had moved from Wes's coat pocket to a small wooden box on the mantel that held, alongside it, a photograph of Thomas Doyle that Mara had finally found the courage to display, a lock of her daughter's baby hair, and a pressed prairie flower from the day of the storm that had nearly cost them Robert entirely. It was, Mara sometimes thought, a strange collection of grief and survival to keep in one small box, but it seemed right to her that the family they'd built should hold space for everyone who had brought them to this particular kitchen, on this particular ranch, rather than pretending any of it had come easily or come from nothing. What began as an arrangement between 2 strangers, built out of nothing but necessity and 6 plain lines in a newspaper, became, in the end, the truest family either of them had ever known. Mara Doyle came to Kansas planning only to survive. She found, instead, exactly what she'd stopped letting herself hope for the day she buried her husband and watched another man start deciding her future for her, and it turned out to have been waiting for her the entire time, 200 miles west, in 6 honest lines that never once promised her anything at all. And if you're enjoying this journey through the American frontier, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps this channel continue bringing you heartfelt stories filled with courage, family, sacrifice, love, and unforgettable twists. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until our next story, remember that the greatest treasures are often hidden where the world forgets to look.